The first thing to talk about in episode 3 is the noticeable tonal shift from the opening 2, as that hopelessness and brutality is now replaced with, albeit still hardship, but one that has a payoff of being able to stand up to the Titans. This is also reinforced by the title of the episode, The Recovery of Mankind, deliberately establishing this as a new beginning from our main trio's perspective, especially because it wouldn't be long until Eren's abilities propels their recovery. Though what might come as an even bigger surprise is the difference in tone in retrospect. When watching the initial couple of episodes, they pretty clearly carry the same feeling of the final season in that we are basically just watching a tragedy. But when it comes to these next couple of episodes and even large chunks of the first season, they have a distinctly different tone that I would liken to classic shonen. And I think parts of it are very much purposeful, but parts are also a little more external. We'll talk about certain instances of this in a second, but if you recall what we talked about regarding the first opening, much of the season is about that larger-than-life story of overcoming impossible odds as humanity rises against the Titans. And so, if you haven't seen the first season in a while, I'd wager many of you have forgotten that it very much had some of those classic anime tropes, most of which are nowhere to be seen even by the time you reach season 2. And the way I see it, there are 5 main reasons for this. Number 1 is very simple: monkey brain. These types of action-y shonen training arcs have simply proven to sell. So if you want to get your story off the ground, putting it there just to get eyes on it before you actually delve into the meat of the story is just a safe route. Tropes exist for a reason after all, they work. Especially when it comes to anime, so many things are considered as industry standard, it is just a strategically safe route to go. Number 2 is also a simple yet practical one: the animation studio. Because of all the controversy recently, I'm fairly certain everyone knows that WIT produced the first 3 seasons and MAPPA took over after. But the thing is, if you go back to 2012 and 2013, you will quickly realize that Attack on Titan was basically WIT's first ever big production. So much of this could just be the studio finding their groove as, again, many of these classic anime reaction shots etc. would disappear in just a few episodes. Number 3 is one I've alluded to before, to contrast Eren's journey further into the series. Fundamentally, as we've talked about before, his drive has never changed, it's rather everything surrounding it that has withered away. The once excited Eren is replaced by a cold and distant person, who has essentially lost all personality aside from that initial drive to ensure that everything outside of the walls falls. But number 4, and perhaps most importantly, it directly mirrors the training of the Marleyan shifters. Remember that each and every one of the Titans in Marley joined the military purely out of necessity. Eldians are shunned from their society, so the only way to reclaim some sort of social status was to join the military, where becoming a Titan and essentially signing your own death warrant in 13 years was seen as the highest honor. Contrast that to Paradis, where each and every one of the recruits came here because they want to fight. Sure, you can argue that a part of it was still out of necessity, but compared to the Marleyans, there is a lot more free will involved. So in essence, it both shows you how differently their stories began, but how they still converge to that same senseless violence we've already seen and are now seeing in the final season. But with all that said, hold on to that thought for now because I've got one more reason in store. When it comes to the episode itself, it opens right where we left off, with the new recruits all lined up and Commander Keith giving his speech. And one part of these seemingly heartless commanders in media that I've always enjoyed is the actual moral complexity of their characters that lies underneath that facade. It's a bit of a trope, that's for sure, but keep in mind that this whole drill sergeant nasty persona is designed to protect them. If they can't hold their own against a person screaming at them, they'll die outside of the walls in 10 seconds flat. So in most cases, in reality, these characters are actually extremely empathetic, And because of these recruits' lives are essentially in their hands, they want to do everything in their power to protect them, even if that means being pointlessly cruel toward them, as it's merely weeding out the weak. And that would be further showcased once we later learn in the series that Keith was actually the one who sabotaged Eren's equipment just because he wanted to protect him. Another thing that we see here is the importance of Shiganshina being reinforced, as everyone who was there during those attacks are basically celebrities already and get an easy pass during these initial drills. This essentially reminds you that what we saw was a historical event, and nothing like that has happened before or since. So simply surviving that is already praiseworthy. Though returning to what I touched on before, unlike the first couple of episodes, this one has some comedy right off the bat, as Connie first messes up the salute, and we then see everyone's favorite potato girl chowing down in the background. Sasha would of course become one of the most beloved characters and a massive meme in the community, but in retrospect, I think you'll agree that she is a personality that does seem somewhat out of place in a series that eventually becomes as dark as Attack on Titan. Instead, I'd say she is much more in line with, again, typical shonen casts where the majority of the characters have some sort of quirk to them. And I think this is one of those things that is super interesting to watch develop, because by the time we roll around to the final season, I think you'll agree that basically all characters seem much more down to earth and realistic. Which once again prompts the question of what exactly were Isayama's initial plans when it comes to the big picture? Was this comedy angle one that was always meant to be left behind as the world becomes much more cruel to the cast? Or maybe it was a gag or even a reference to another meat enjoyer in anime that received more love from the readers than Isayama ever predicted and turned into a running joke? Or perhaps it was just a strategic decision to make it appeal to a wider audience? We'll most likely never know for sure, but it's certainly interesting to talk about, as Sasha's food obsessions have always been a very charming yet somewhat bizarre part of the series. Though in a broader sense, the sheer absurdity of how serious the scene is while they're literally discussing why she's eating a potato is just brilliant. So perhaps it's not surprising that this almost JoJo-like moments or very silly moments being played off as extremely serious ones became such a popular meme. A short while later, we get another bunch of scenes where the importance of that day in Shiganshina is reinforced, as we see Connie and the others ask Eren about what it was like. And I think that morbid fascination that each and every one of us has was captured very well here. They all obviously know that it was a tragedy, but they can't help but ask a million questions. And similarly, because information obviously doesn't travel fast in the setting, they also want to confirm all the legends they've heard of the Colossal with someone who has a first-hand account. In many ways, I think this also demonstrates just how detached a large part of society is. Because to them, a Titan attack is about as real as it was for those guards back in episode 1. They simply do not happen. So not surprisingly, they may overlook the very dark reality of what really happened there, and only focus on almost the mythical-like aspect of everything they know. There are countless parallels you can draw here with our fascination of true crime among many other things, but in short, I think this was a very realistic representation of how most people would react. But what I think is particularly cheeky here is what we see once the Armored Titan is brought up. Because just as Eren begins to explain it, for the first time ever in this scene, we cut away from Eren's table and see a particular someone listening to their talk. We'll be talking plenty more about these sorts of shenanigans later as well, but saying the Armored Titan and literally cutting to the Armored Titan is the type of cheekiness I absolutely love. Clearly, on initial viewing, there is no way you could ever draw anything from this, but in retrospect, it is such a clear case of just teasing the viewer and literally giving you the answer. Like I've mentioned before, it's details like this that have always made the series so enjoyable to watch. Both because it's just funny seeing how many times the show literally showed you what they were talking about, as well as all the more nuanced clues that were left along the way. Especially because I feel like many shows nowadays are so scared of people figuring out beforehand that they never even give you the opportunity to solve the mystery yourself. Following this, we get a bit more philosophical as we see the clashing ideologies of Jean and Eren. As you'd expect, Eren's going on about exterminating everything outside of the walls and all that, only for Jean to call him out and say that he should just be honest with himself and say that he is terrified like the rest of them. In the wider story, we do of course know that Eren was likely never truly scared, but when taken in isolation, I think there is a very interesting conversation to be had here. On one hand, exactly how we saw, if nothing is done about the Titans, the same thing that happened in Shiganshina will happen again. So clearly, Eren's drive is one that all of humanity should share. At the end of the day, if everyone sits back, they'll just be wiped out, right? But on the other, like we also saw, no matter how many soldiers go outside of the walls, nothing is ever achieved. The Titans simply keep coming. And with the Armored and Colossal, their power was so overwhelming that even if they had prepared, they'd still be helpless against them. So is Jean's perspective of just opting for a safe position and not wasting his life really that crazy? And so, you're locked in a sort of a prisoner's dilemma. Neither side is entirely right, and based on what we've seen so far, you can easily argue for both. It's a super short scene and we don't really delve any deeper than that, but like we saw with Hans back in episode 1, I think it's one that does spark discussion about what you would do in their situation. Soon thereafter, we get another scene that, in retrospect, feels somewhat out of place, as we see a conversation between Historia and Sasha. The whole red glowing eyes and howling for food is obviously typical anime humor, but again, in Attack on Titan, it just seems different. I obviously won't mention each of these moving forwards, but I do think that they are in large part due to the show finding its footing in these early parts. Though what I think is the most important part here is the introduction of Historia and Ymir. Very similar to what we've discussed with the main trio, their core personalities are established right away. Historia is a kind-hearted person who just wants everyone to be happy, and is just out here to essentially find herself, while Ymir sees kindness as a favor to cash in later. Considering where their stories would go and who they actually both are, I think the fundamental parts of their characters were established quite well in this scene. Following this, we get a bit of a lore dump regarding the ODM gear, and also get a bit more of that classic training arc vibe of the main character failing miserably despite their intense drive. In retrospect, again, we of course know that Hans gave Eren faulty equipment and was just trying to fail him on purpose to protect him. But in a broader sense, there are a few noteworthy things. Number one, while the whole training arc is very much run-of-the-mill for these types of stories, I do think that the way Attack on Titan handled it was very good. Considering there are many stories out there which would turn this into an entire arc or at least sub-arc, condensing it into a mere 10 minutes still gave it that oomph of Eren finally learning the gear while never getting old and repetitive. I think everyone can appreciate a good training montage, but when they stretch into multiple episodes, it can get old. So it being very short and snappy was a big win in my opinion. Number 2, I think the ODM gear itself is just incredibly creative, and it's no surprise that many have tried to recreate it in games and whatnot. The way I see it, it's essentially just a more nuanced and complex form of good old web swinging, and everyone loves web swinging, so it's just a win-win. And let's not ignore the monkey brain side of us. Obviously seeing the scouts fly around just means some animation eye candy, and again, everyone loves that. Though in retrospect, I think many of us have forgotten just how big of a deal it was in pop culture in general back then. Obviously now the show is much more concerned with the big picture of the Titan War, but I still think the very concept of the ODM gear is absolutely praiseworthy. Number 3, and this is a bit of a puzzling one, there's this scene where Eren bonks his head on the ground and his head is actually steaming. Considering all the anime tropes we've discussed already, obviously you write this off as a joke, right? But knowing what we know now, was it a joke? I think there's a case to be made either way if I'm being honest. It could legit just be Titan regeneration. But we also know that regeneration is not just a passive ability. The wielder can choose whether he wants to regenerate or not. That's exactly how Eren walked around without a leg after all. And considering that at this point in the story, Eren neither knows that he has powers or how to control them, you can also argue that this simply cannot be regeneration because he doesn't know how to do that. So feel free to chime in on this one. Are you just going with the Occam's razor and saying that Eren is angry and that's a joke? Or is it straight up regeneration? But number 4, and this might very much be me titularly overanalyzing the series, but notice how when we see all the quabbles between Mikasa and Eren, Armin is positioned right in between, once again fulfilling his peacekeeper role to a T. Who knows if it was intentional or not, but hey, that won't stop me from nerding out about it, okay? Soon after, we see Eren go to the last people he can ask for advice, Bertolt and Reiner. And these scenes hit so different in retrospect. Reiner first tells Eren that he can't really help him, but before Eren can leave, Bertolt speaks up asking if they were also in Shiganshina, and follows up by asking if they know the horrors of the Titans, why would they even want to become soldiers? Keeping in mind his personality and background, I'd go as far as to say that this is both him trying to protect Eren and Armin, as well as just sheer morbid curiosity, because remember that it's been drilled into his mind that the people in the walls are devils. But after infiltrating the walls, he obviously began to learn that they are not so different. So he wants to take this opportunity and ask why would they put their lives on the line? Maybe in hopes of rationalizing Marley's goals, or maybe just to find out who these people really are. As we see later in the series, out of basically all the Marleyan Titans, Bertolt always seemed to be the one who hated what they were doing the most. And I think that in hindsight, that part of him is actually captured very well here. Though as their conversation continues, things get even more interesting. The thing you'll notice when you rewatch this episode is how many times Reiner stops Bertolt before he can finish a sentence or thought. Almost as if keeping him in check and stopping him from saying something that he shouldn't technically know. On initial viewing, that of course just seemed like Reiner protecting his friend from talking about tragic memories. But they really feel much different in retrospect. And similarly, Bertolt tells Eren and Armin that they are different from quote-unquote them. Again, on initial viewing, as he'd himself explained, he's referring to the people who haven't seen the Titans themselves. In retrospect, however, could he be referring to his training in Marley? Keep in mind that he has already undergone a lot of training, and likely found himself in these sorts of bunk bed talks many times before. Only there, he might not have been talking to fellow Eldians. So Eren and Armin are very much different in that sense. Though on the flip side, if he is actually referring to the Titans, that too carries a much different meaning in retrospect, because in essence, he is talking about himself. From Eren's perspective, he obviously saw the Titans as the invader who brought nothing but death and destruction, while from Bertolt's perspective, he is that death and destruction. And I think that scene of Armin's Colossal later encapsulates that perfectly, as he asks himself, is this what you saw, Bertolt? Think back to all the Marley victories we heard about, and just try to picture how many times by this point Bertolt had already nuked entire cities and killed millions. So again, from his perspective, he is largely the reason why people like Eren are throwing themselves in the meat grinder that are the Scouts. While Eren was changed from seeing death, Bertolt did from causing it. And I think all of that is even more pronounced as they go for a walk in the night. Their conversation continues as Bertolt says that most people here are simply trying to protect their social status, saying that choosing to work in a factory nowadays is considered cowardly, finishing with, not that I'm really much different from them. And once again, the double meaning in this one is so good. The way he's casually talking about Marley and his past while dressing all of that up in what's going on here is absolutely on point. And in a broader sense, I think it further drives home that idea we've talked about in previous parts. In the grand scheme of things, the story of Attack on Titan ultimately mirrors itself, in that Eren goes from being the one attacked by Marley's titans to being the attacker in quite literally a titan form himself. Because in this case, Bertolt is essentially talking about his life in Marley, yet that is also perfectly applicable to Paradis, so are they really any different? Ditto for Reiner. He too says that he will go back to his homeland, which retrospectively we obviously know to be Marley. And again, you can apply the same exact type of thinking here as well, because Eren too wants to return to Shiganshina and live out his life peacefully. But for him to do that, he still needs to fulfill his mission. In Reiner's case, that's acquiring the Founding Titan, while in Eren's, it's exterminating the Titans outright. I've touched on this before, but I think it's this fundamental clashes of goals and beliefs that I think really set Attack on Titan apart. Rarely have I seen a show with such replayability value as we see here, where everything Reiner and Bertolt say is seen in a completely different light than on initial viewing. And the interesting part doesn't end there, because we're still yet to talk about Eren. When Reiner passes on the question of why they enlisted to Eren, we once again get to hear Eren's drive, which, surprise surprise, also entails the super detailed and vivid view of his eye. No clue why they have a blue tinge to them in this scene, but considering in the last frame they were green as usual, it's likely just a bit of an animation oversight when it comes to color grading. But anyway, aside from the eye, I think what's more important here are Reiner's and Bertolt's reactions, because they are seriously shook by Eren's wish to kill them all. Obviously, this is a pretty extreme thing for anyone to say, so some reaction is probably to be expected regardless. But I have another perspective on that. Keep in mind that both Reiner and Bertolt grew up knowing one simple thing. The people on Paradis are devils incarnate, and they wish to destroy the world. Of course, this is pretty hard to imagine, but I'd wager if you were to grow up in such an echo chamber, no matter how much real-life experience you'd gain afterwards, that initial belief and fear of quote-unquote them would still remain. It's all they've ever heard, right? So perhaps Eren literally confirming those fears is what caused their pronounced reaction. To give you another point of reference, think of something like North Sentinel Island. If you've never heard of it before, in short, it's an island of an essentially uncontacted tribe that still lives like the hunter-gatherers, and every time outsiders have tried to approach it, it hasn't really ended well. It's a really fascinating read, so I'd recommend looking into it further if that sounds interesting to you. But anyway, while in Attack on Titan, the technological contrast and everything else of that nature isn't as pronounced as it is with North Sentinel, for the people of Marley, or better yet the entire world of Attack on Titan, in many ways, Paradis is just as foreign. So try to put yourself in that position. You are in a completely foreign land that is a good few hundred years behind technologically, and among people who you've always been told are extremely dangerous. Obviously, you'd be on edge the entire time, so not surprisingly, Reiner is shook after hearing Eren calmly say that he thought he had to exterminate all Titans, because remember that he is a Titan. It's one of those things that I've always found fascinating in stories like these, where we have these two different sides with a drastically different understanding of the world. And I also think it's a core reason why we are so interested in alien stories, because just like with us in North Sentinel, we like to think of aliens as these beings with knowledge beyond our understanding. Out of fear of rambling on about these sorts of stories for 3 more hours, I'll just say that while in Attack on Titan's case, that is of course on a much smaller level, I still think the technological contrast between Marley and Paradis and the isolation of Paradis is one of the show's strongest hooks. Returning to the story though, the next morning we see their final ODM exam where we get more of that quite unfamiliar tone I mentioned before. And in this case, we tick absolutely all the boxes. The MC is struggling with something, they go against all odds, and just when things start looking up, they still fail. But by a twist of fate, it turns out that they still somehow won. Your typical YA type story, right? Which is exactly why I keep bringing it up. It feels so out of place in Attack on Titan. I already gave some reasons as to why I think this is the case, but in this particular scene, I'd say all of that is even more pronounced, as even the music is different from what we're used to now. And now that we've essentially reached the end of episode 3 and begin to look forwards, I can offer up my final reasoning for having this sort of vibe. And that is to yet again establish that stark contrast to follow. Because yes, in isolation, these wacky moments are, well, wacky. But when we look ahead to what happens in episode 4 with the Colossal appearing once again, much of that positivity is immediately invalidated, right? Much of episode 3 and 4 are all about Eren's drive to become a soldier and fight the Titans, all enveloped in that hopeful rising up type of tone. And in most other series, as I've already mentioned, this would be an entire arc. The characters would get stronger and stronger until they finally went against the big bads. Whereas in Attack on Titan, we get lured into a false sense of security with all the wackiness we see in this episode, and right on the heels of that, the rug is pulled from under you and the Colossal is back. But I just wanted to touch on that for now, as we'll leave most of that for next time. And in case you are following along with the rewatch yourself, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that difference in tone as well, so feel free to drop a comment about that. But with all that said, we get to the final scenes of the episode, which, in classic wit-like fashion, are pure eye candy. Though I still have a couple of things to mention here. First off, and I think this is something that really needs to be acknowledged, especially in Attack on Titan, can we just appreciate how many times we see horses in the series? In case you didn't know, horses are notoriously difficult to draw and animate, to the point that they are essentially all done with CG. So in many cases, instead of getting flamed by angry internet people who are in fact the best animators in the industry, animation studios just do creative shots to hide the horses running completely. Whereas in Attack on Titan, in many cases, it almost feels like, hey, look at this, cool horse, huh? But secondly, and I admit this might be a stretch, remember those opening shots of episode 1 of the scouts on that night mission in the rain? Well, the way I see it, this shot of the new generation of scouts zipping through the forest in a very similar fashion, only this time with a peaceful and warm sunshine, sort of signifies the end of not quite the prologue, because that's what we saw in the first 2 episodes, but more so this first big step, following which it's absolutely pedal to the metal. So yeah, it may not be intentional, but again, you can't stop me from nerding out about it, okay? And lastly, yes, the eye candy in this scene is praiseworthy. That is something Wits animation has always excelled in. Movement always feels so dynamic and fluid that it's just perfect. And because we'll be nerding out over animation plenty more, that's where I'll leave that for now. But yes, that is episode 3. As I think we've already discussed at length, a much different one from the opening 2, but an equally important one in establishing the wider world and tone. Even though this one was fairly light on massive foreshadowing and everything else of that nature, it still turned out to be longer than the episode itself, which I think goes to show just how packed some of these lighter episodes even are. Be it with interesting meta discussions or broader story beats or even animation, etc, etc. But anyway, with that, I hope to see you back for episode 4, where we'll reunite with the big boy Colossal and continue overanalyzing Attack on Titan. And that's the video. First off, I wanted to apologize for the long wait. My plans were turned upside down with a few troubles behind the scenes and IRL, but now we're back in business, and the episode 4 video is already in the works. But with that, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my ramblings, so seriously, thank you. And if you wish to join the highly coveted Mystery Shack Insiders Club, you can do so for as little as $1 per month. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.